Hey strangers, there's one thing we know for sure as business owners ourselves. The less your business spends, the more margin you keep. But today, everything costs more. So, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one proven platform, helping you reduce IT costs, maintenance costs, and manual errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move to NetSuite. Backed by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/strange. netsuite.com/strange.
Hey, true crime fans! Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free, or go to amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime to catch up on the latest episodes, without the ads.
I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers, we assume that you, as lovers of the unusual and unexplainable, have attained a comprehensive knowledge of the weird. Alien terminology, cryptozoological details, every flavor of ghost imaginable. And then there are the urban legends, our modern myths with a strain of horror that are told like truth. You know, something that happened years back, over in that one town. Or maybe they happened to a friend of a friend. That story of the hook dangling from the car door handle after a close call at a lover's lane. That fried rat and a bucket of chicken from the fast food joint. The bloody woman summoned in the mirror. We bet that you could name a dozen more. But there is another strain of spooky story, one that's unique to the 21st century, that has a fully digital origin, the creepypasta. The line between an urban legend and a creepypasta is admittedly a bit blurry, but creepypasta do tend to have some unique features. They're horror stories that originate online, and they are meant to be fiction. Of course, some do make it over to the other side, and they pass for real, and the lines, they do get blurred. Sometimes they're connected with a specific image or video clip. It's usually pretty easy to trace their origins if you do a little digging. You can find when a story or meme first originated and began circulating on a board or site with just a little effort. Plus, there are internet historians that have proven more than happy to create timelines of how these legends have grown, and we do thank them for their service. No doubt you have encountered many of the more famous examples. There's Slender Man, Jeff the Killer, Momo, the nightmare-inducing bird woman who popped up in children's YouTube videos. We could go on. Some of the examples are almost universally known as creepypasta from their very inception. Then they shift and they grow, gathering their own organic lore. The internet-born horror of Slender Man is probably the best example of that. Other stories, though, they disseminate in more convoluted ways. The best example might be the photos that sprang up to accompany the viral creepypasta called Russian Sleep Experiment. The story is a pretty old one as far as internet-bred horror goes. According to Snopes, it popped up sometime around 2010. It tells the story of test subjects in, yes, Russia, being given an experimental drug that prevented sleep, with apparently terrifying results. If you know anything about creepypasta, it's that the origin of the phrase, a play on copy-paste, is very apt. The stories, they can pop up anywhere, and that means that they can change, too. So it's not odd that a few images began to circulate with the tale, ones that the original author had not included. One such image showed men in gas masks of all different styles who were said to be conducting the experiment and protecting themselves from the insomnia-inducing chemical. And another image was much more terrifying, and it's the one that you likely remember. It showed a hunched, hollow-eyed, skeletal man who was supposedly deprived of sleep to the point of death. Eventually, the images made their way onto social media with a very shortened version of the story, a sort of, "Did you know about this 1940s Russian experiment?" kind of blurb, and that has sent many people in search of answers. They want to know, are these pictures real? What about the sleep experiment? The photos are far enough separated from their creepypasta inspiration that they've developed their own little lore. A 2017 YouTube video by Rainbot breaks down the actual origin of the photos. The first of the men in the gas masks is actually from World War I. It, quote, shows soldiers displaying the gas masks of the US, Britain, France, and Germany. And as for that terrifying skeletal man, you'll be relieved to know that it was a spirit Halloween prop named, of all things, Spasm, with a particularly effective filter thrown on. So the terrifying lore is pretty easily explained, but how it came together is a fascinating lesson in modern myth-making. Strangers, as you have surely seen, both urban legends and creepypasta are cultural phenomenon. But now that we live so much of our lives in the digital space, perhaps that line isn't so clear-cut. A story originates in one land and then grows in another. It all becomes enmeshed. And perhaps there is no better example than a strange tale that grew up in that in-between space, in the early internet age, just before the turn of the century, when an email chain letter or listserv might send a story slithering out across the world. The virality back then was slower, sure. What took weeks or months in the 90s can be accomplished in a day in 2024. But it was viral all the same. And 25 years later, we're left to ponder something that just might be one of the first digital urban legends. BEKs, or black-eyed kids. You've probably heard the stories of purported encounters with these not-quite-human beings. They're ubiquitous on TikTok, in the British tabloids, on every variation of paranormal YouTube channel. Tales of creepy kids who approach the unsuspecting and seem harmless until they don't. That is the whole conceit. These children are not outright frightening, though they may cause a sense of slight unease. Because, of course, they're children. What's to be afraid of? Nothing. Not until you see their inhuman eyes. And of course, the witnesses never do notice those. Not at first. The details of BEK encounters vary. Children, usually in pairs, but there might be a few, or even a pack, they appear. Sometimes they look just a little out of place. Maybe their clothes are old-fashioned. Or, as PBS notes, they're just as apt to be dressed in hoodies. They might seem waif-like, lost, helpless, or they might be self-assured. These children can seem too young to be out alone or be practically teenagers. But there is one consistent behavior. They approach adults. They ask for something. A ride, to come inside, to be invited in. And that seems to be key. As multiple sources note, the black-eyed children, they have to ask. They need your permission, but they'll be insistent about getting it. It's always at nighttime. The adults, and it is adults that they approach, are usually alone, going about their normal lives, walking to their cars, standing at ATMs, closing up businesses for the night. They might even be relaxing at home, perfectly safe, when a knock comes at that door. And there, on the doorstep, or at their car window, or standing on the sidewalk, are a couple of kids. According to PBS, it's then that the children ask to enter the house, or the business, or the car, just for a minute. They need a ride. They're cold. They need to call their mom. And something feels off. It always takes the adults a little while to notice the children have solid black eyes, because that makes sense from a plot perspective, doesn't it? But when they finally do, here's what they see. As Business Insider describes, quote, pure black from lid to lid, dead black orbs devoid of sclera or iris. And once the adults notice that, well, it's around that time that the children start demanding to be let in. None of the stories that we've read end with the adults giving in to the creepy children's pleas, which makes sense considering they've ostensibly lived to tell the tales. And there has been plenty of online speculation as to what exactly BEKs might be. Aliens? Ghosts? Vampires? Which is a logical suggestion with the whole need to be invited in thing. Or perhaps even demons. One woman in England, a psychic named Christine Hamlet, told the Express and Star that she encountered a black-eyed kid in Cannock Chase in Staffordshire. In her opinion, the child wasn't a demon or a vampire, but rather a ghost. She said that the BEK was, quote, most likely the victim of a diphtheria outbreak in the 1800s, and that, quote, the disease diphtheria was known for causing victims to suffer paralysis in their eyes, making their sockets appear sunken. No word on whether that is related to the broader explanation for the appearance of black-eyed children, or why they want, so badly, to come inside. Another woman in Ireland had a much more classic experience. Karis Holdworth told the Express back in 2011 that she arrived home to her apartment in Belfast. It was late, almost 11 p.m., so it was strange to see two boys standing just outside her door on what she described as, quote, a small patch of grass. These boys were young, between 13 and 16, but when they looked at her, Karis froze. She told the paper, quote, I felt raw fear when I laid eyes on them. I was ready to defend myself if one of them made any sudden movements. Which was strange, she knew, because they hadn't done anything. But Karis couldn't shake the feeling. She had her pepper spray in one hand. But they didn't make a move toward her. Instead, she said, the older one asked if they could use her phone. When he did, she noticed his eyes. Strangers, you will be unsurprised to find out they were pure black. As she headed toward her apartment, she said the boys kept pleading to use her phone, and she felt a strange urge to allow them to. But she ignored that urge and she hurried inside. Then the knocking started. When she looked through her peephole, all she could see were their black eyes. They knocked and begged. She said it kept up until she called a friend for help, and when her friend arrived, the boys finally left. There are hundreds of other stories like Karis's out there, largely posted on internet forums or gathered in spooky compilations for YouTube or podcasts. The thing that frightens people so much, we think, is a pretty ancient concept: evil lurking under innocence. Our first thought when we found out about black-eyed kids was that the whole idea reminded us of old European folklore and the concept of changelings. If you're unfamiliar, the Irish Post explains that, quote, changelings were fairies who'd been left in place of a human child or baby who'd been stolen by the fairies. We're not the only people to have made that connection. A few scholars have mused on the role of monstrous creatures that have taken on the shape of children, a sort of fairy story for the internet age. But speaking of that part, what makes BEKs a truly modern tale is our ability to trace its inception as a story. Unlike some urban legends, which have more general roots, the birth of the black-eyed kids phenomena can be pinpointed to a precise moment in the early internet age. Per the Abilene Reporter News, that would be a 1998 missive to what the paper describes as, quote, a small email group. We'd call it a listserv, which escaped its original confines, and then spread and spread. The email was written by a journalist named Brian Bethel, He wasn't reporting on the event at the time, he's always said, just sharing his experience with like-minded friends. But the story got out and, well, did what stories do. According to PBS, Brian's experience actually took place 2 years prior, in 1996, but he didn't get around to telling it on the listserv until 1998. The following is a version of that tale as he told it in his own column in the Abilene Reporter News back in 2013. At the time, he'd been asked to appear on a TV program, and he said he'd agreed, but, quote, with a touch of reluctance, because, as a reporter, he was the one used to doing the interviewing. And, we have to imagine, because of the experience that he was relating. It had to do, Brian said, with something that had happened either in the spring or summer of 1996. He can't remember more specifically than that. And it occurred in the parking lot of a set of local businesses. In what feels like the absolute perfect touch, Brian had headed over that evening to drop off a check, in person, for his internet service. Talk about a slice of the mid-90s experience. Brian explained that his service provider's office was near a local movie theater, which he said was showing the new release, Mortal Kombat. That movie, the original, was actually released in August of 1995, so Brian might be off by more than just a season in his telling, but no matter. Anyway, Brian sat in the darkened parking lot in his vehicle. He had to finish writing his check before hopping out to leave it in the Dropbox. But then, Brian said, quote, there was a knock on my driver's side window. 2 young boys, somewhere between 9 to 12 years old, and dressed in hooded pullovers, stood outside. I cracked the window a bit, anticipating a spiel for money, but I was immediately gripped by an incomprehensible, soul-racking fear. I had no idea why. Brian said that one boy did the talking. The boy told Brian that they were there to see the movie, quote, but had left their money at their mother's house. Can I give them a ride? But Brian noticed that, based on the theater sign, it was clear that the movie had already started. They'd never have time to go get money and still watch it. Brian said, though, that they still begged him. They said it would just be a quick ride. Couldn't they just get in? Brian wrote that it wasn't long before, quote, I noticed that my hand had strayed toward the lock on my door. I pulled it away, perhaps a bit too violently. The boys did not like that. And that's when Brian saw it. Quote, both boys stared at me with coal-black eyes. The sort of eyes one sees these days on aliens or bargain basement vampires on late-night television. Soulless orbs like 2 great swaths of starless night. When Brian rolled up his window, he said they began to bang on it because they insisted that he had to open his car door himself. We can't come in unless you say it's okay. Let us in. As you might imagine, Brian sped away from that parking lot in absolute terror. He wrote that when he finally looked back in his rearview mirror, quote, the boys were gone. So why tell the story on that email listserv a few years later? Brian said, quote, it was more or less a cathartic exercise, and that once it, quote, got out into the wider internet, others were the ones who came up with the language to explain what he'd seen, aka the phrase, black-eyed kids. When Brian began to read those other stories from other people, he honestly had some mixed feelings. He wrote that some encounters sounded so much like his that they honestly seemed like hoaxes, copies, but that, quote, others have a more subtle ring of the same sort of panic and helplessness that I felt. Now, Brian does not claim to know exactly what he saw, except that special effects contacts, they weren't really available in Abilene back in the 1990s. And he wrote, quote, if I'd given the spokesman and his friend a ride on that long ago evening, I don't think I'd be here to type this now. Brian's account, spread on the internet as a pocket-sized horror story, has all the hallmarks of a perfect creepypasta. Except, of course, that creepypasta is supposed to be fiction, and this story has a particularly trustworthy and known source. a reporter even, who states it to be true. So, we can't consider it to be a legend then. Or, we couldn't. Except for one strange thing. Floating out there, around on, what else but the internet, is a theory that Brian's listserv story might not have been a harrowing piece of nonfiction, but rather an intentional concoction, and therefore one of the earliest creepypastas around. Now, let it be said, and clearly, we are not here to cast aspersions on anyone or to take a stance on this particular issue, but it's interesting enough that we must mention it here, because what a fun little twist. Anyway, a blog titled "It's Probably Aliens" dug up a listserv message that Brian wrote back in 1997, a year before he first circulated the Black-Eyed Kids story. This message is pretty long, so we'll just give you the broad strokes, but in part, it's a reflection on the power of group belief to create a kind of magic. Very specifically, he used the example of Bloody Mary and how the legend had traveled all over. How, somehow, every kid knew of her and believed and was afraid. Did that group belief create a kind of magic when it spread through the power of story? He mused on the power of creating that kind of magic. And that is something to think about. Because, strangers, you can see how some people have connected the dots there. They wonder, did Brian go on a year or so later and stir up his own piece of urban legend magic? Did he wait to watch it spread? If so, he likely could not have imagined its eventual reach. We, of course, can't say for sure. But it does make us think about what's created when all those creepypastas go floating through our digital space. Do they tie us together in precisely the same way the old stories used to? It seems silly on the surface that a meme of a Halloween prop or a ghostly Slender Man could be imbued with power, but how else do we create our archetypes? Fear has always taken on the shape of the people who were watching for it around the corners. And now that we have access to everything, well, those shapes, they are limitless, aren't they? We hope you'll join us next time for another premium exclusive episode of One Strange Thing. Oh, and if you wouldn't mind, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on your favorite app. It helps us find more listeners. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.